The cost of housing, renting or buying it, seems to go in only one direction lately, and that's up and up and up. And while that's making it tough for many to keep a roof over their heads, it's providing tidy returns to investors, according to a documentary having its Canadian premiere tonight on TVO right after this program. The doc is called Push, and it makes the connection between profits and the affordability crisis. With us now to delve into the details, we welcome Benjamin Tal. He is the Deputy Chief Economist at CIBC Capital. Diana Petramala, Senior Researcher at Ryerson University's Centre for Urban Research and Land Development. Martine August, Assistant Professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. And Shaun Hildebrand, President of the real estate market research firm Urban Nation. And we are happy to welcome all of you here to TVO tonight for this conversation. I know that you have all seen the documentary, right, that is airing immediately thereafter. You got a sneak peek. And I think just to sort of set up our conversation and then maybe whet the appetite of the viewers to come, I'd like to get just some initial impressions. Martine, why don't you start us off? What was the sort of most salient fact that emerged for you, having seen it?
I think the main point that they're trying to make in this documentary, which I really took away from it, is pointing to the way that housing, which many of us view as a home, something that ought to be a human right. That's certainly the case that Leilani Farha is trying to make in this film.
This is the UN rapporteur.
The UN Special Rapporteur. The film follows her trying to understand this affordability crisis and this rise of financial investment in housing across the globe. And I think the key point that she's trying to make is the way that we're increasingly seeing housing being treated not as a home, but as a financial asset, as something that's primarily being used to drive profits for investors. And that is having impacts, really negative impacts on people, on communities, and driving affordability and social and spatial inequality.
Good. Shaun, what did you take away?
Well, I thought that the documentary did a very good job of humanizing the issue. So I think really the point was, when you go through massive housing booms like we have globally, there's going to be collateral damage, and there's going to be unintended consequences. And being able to tell the stories of the individuals who have been impacted the most by this, I think was really powerful. I particularly enjoyed some of the statistics that they showed. As someone who collects data, I thought that the documentary did a good job of kind of telling a story with sort of human cases as well as using some of the data. I think perhaps what I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit more is a little bit more focus on some of the policies that have been tried in the past to help correct for the housing affordability situation that we have across the globe. The documentary ended on an optimistic note in that there's a lot of these conversations that are starting to be had really across the globe. And we can kind of triangulate that back to what's happening here in Canada, where the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments are all sort of talking about affordable housing now and making it the top of their agenda.
Diana.
I found it really interesting in the conversation dividing housing or talking about housing as a social good and not a financial asset, whereas here in Canada we treat it as a financial asset. So there is predominantly our housing supply comes through some form of investment and profit seeking, either whether it be developers in development or investors coming in building purpose-built rentals. Someone's investing in that asset with the anticipation of making a return. We can't expect them to do it for free, and the government spends very little on housing. So I'm not sure why we expected outcomes to be any different in that environment. I do feel that there are some challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunities with the financialization of housing. One being a lot of our rental stock now is coming from some of this international investment, and the construction of purpose-built rentals is now at the highest level since 1992. So
it's coming back big time, isn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of the developers, if they want to build a development, they rely on that investment in pre-development stages in order to get their financings. They have to sell 80% of the development before they can get their financing. And 50% of those condos that they're building is being added to the rental stock. So it is a really important factor helping to drive supply now. So I worry about penalizing it when it's actually there's opportunities from the financialization of housing.
Speaking of financing, shall we hear from the banker?
Yeah.
Okay, Benjamin, your view.
First, I think it was a wonderful documentary, and I think that viewers should stick around and actually watch the documentary. It's a beautifully done documentary. It tells a story. The human face of the crisis we call real estate at this point. We also know from this documentary, this is not just about Toronto or Vancouver. We are not so special. It's everywhere. This is very important to understand. I totally agree with Shaun that what's missing, and maybe that was not the purpose of this documentary, is solutions. This is a very good tale of the problem without discussing potential solutions.
That's going to be our job over the next half an hour.
Absolutely, but it was a wonderful documentary.
Good, okay. Well, let's whet the appetites a little bit more, shall we? Here is a short snippet from Push, on immediately after this program. Sheldon, the clip if you would.
A new owner came and took possession of the building. They were breaking locks for the main entrance for the building. They were physically pushing their way into people's apartments upstairs.
I hear stories of nurses and doctors and police officers and firefighters who are unable to afford to live in the city where they're supposed to be guarding and helping. I'm giving you this notice because I want to end your tenancy.
They came after her with the hardest category they could. The neighborhood's getting gentrified. It's moving. It's come right up to King and Dufferin, and it's only one direction into our neighbor, and we're in the way.
When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is, if only. It's much deeper than that.
Housing has become overly financialized, so it's like gold. But gold is not a human right. Housing is.
Now, you may have seen this chart right at the very beginning of the clip, and if you're listening to this right now on podcast, let me just describe it a little bit for you. It's a graph. There are two lines on the graph. The bottom line is wages, and that is essentially a straight line across. The second line is home prices, and that one is on a 45-degree angle, and you can see that as time goes by, there is an increasing mismatch between what the price of a home costs and what people earn and are therefore able to afford. We've got a couple of numbers here we can add to that. The average family income has risen by 133%. The average home price has risen by 425%, this in the Greater Toronto Area. Again, you see the mismatch that goes on here. Benjamin, let me follow up with you. If housing prices are rising so much more quickly than wages are able to purchase, what does that tell us about the state of the housing market?
That is unsustainable. That's what we know. But the issue is the word average. Average wage. As we know from high school mathematics, it doesn't tell you the whole story. We know that the income gap in Canada, in the US, in Europe is widening at a rate we haven't seen before. That's the main issue. The focus is always on debt, how much debt people take in order to buy this house. It's not on income. The debt to income ratio is at 170%, a record high. Everybody in Canada knows this number. I think it should be part of the citizenship test or something. But the issue also must be income. Income in Canada is not rising. 20 years from now, when people study this Great Recession and the big expansion that we have, they will realize that what was defining this expansion is not Trump, not even trade. It is the demise of the wage mechanism. Many people are able to buy real estate in Toronto and Vancouver because they have the income, but many people cannot. The mismatch that you were talking about is the mismatch in the labor market. People without jobs and jobs without people. This income gap is actually being revealed in the real estate market, where people that can afford it buy expensive, and they can do that. But many people cannot do that. That's the story.
Shaun, since you're the data guy here, I want you, if you can, to tell us, do you have any idea what percentage of people are buying homes to live in and what percentage are buying homes as an investment vehicle?
So within the condo market, for instance, where most of investment activity is focused, about 35% of the entire condo stock is investor-owned. Within that, about 14 to 15% is foreign-owned. And actually, an interesting stat is that about 5% of that stock is actually empty. And you can sort of relate that back to one of the interesting stats from the documentary that showed that 80% of properties in London were foreign-owned.
Wasn't that map shocking?
And they're empty.
Actually, can we see that? You got that standing by? Let's play that right now, since you've touched on that, because
Sure.
when you see that map, that is really an astonishing thing. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll that one too.
This place is now a bit of a dead zone. We have very little indication of who the owners are. And a lot of them are completely empty, so you can't go up and ask them who they are. They're actually just empty all the time.
Now, that's in London, UK, where 80% of the properties are empty. And again, if you're listening on podcast, we're looking at a map of the City of London around Regent's Park, and there are red dots scattered all over this map. It almost overwhelms the map. Are we far away from this in the Greater Toronto Area?
Yeah, I don't think we're there.
We're not there.
No. Certainly we have a pretty high percentage, particularly in the downtown core, of condominium units that are owned by investors. It's probably closer to about 50% when you look at a downtown condo building. But as Diana alluded to, we've been almost entirely relying on these condo investors to supply rental units to the market because we haven't been building traditional market rate purpose-built rental housing to any sort of notable quantity for 35 years. So basically what you see is that when a condo reaches completion, fully half of the units go directly into the rental market. And they're absorbed very quickly. But what we're recognizing is that even with all of this condo building that's been happening and all of this condo investment that's been occurring, it hasn't been enough to satisfy demand because the rents keep rising. The average rent for a condominium in Toronto is $2,400 a month, and it's risen by 30% in the last 3 years.
For what size apartment?
This would be 650 square feet. Yeah, so maybe a 1 plus 10, a 1 plus 10, something like that. A two-bedroom would run you closer to around $2,800 a month. And we've been relying on these condo investors to continue to do this. The issue is that we sort of view this as somewhat precarious supply in the sense that you're relying on mom and pop investors to supply rental units to a population that's seeing the highest levels of rental demand that we've seen in a generation. And when we look at the financial situation of these condo investors, they're barely breaking even on a cash flow basis. And the situation is only going to continue to become more challenging as prices continue to rise.
Let's stop there for a second. Sure. Diana, can you talk to us about what you think the implications of that math are?
Of prices continuing to go up and then housing continuing to become unaffordable.
Of all of what he just said, particularly as it relates to lots of empty units. They're owned, but they're sitting empty. 5% of the units there are empty. I mean, we got people who are looking for places to live, and we've got lots of empty units, and people can't get in. Anyway, implications of all of this.
And I think there's, again, productive and unproductive investment in the housing market, and so vacant units are definitely unproductive, and the government needs to figure out how to get those back on the market. I think implications are we're seeing home ownership is moving out of reach for a lot of people in the region, and we're seeing now higher income households that would have been homeowners are eating up what would have been affordable supply for households in the rental market. So the average income for renters is rising faster than the average income for homeowners. And that's not because we're seeing employment gain, because we're seeing higher income households staying in longer or going into the rental market when they should be in the homeowner market. And that's crowding out people who have lower incomes. So it's coming at the expense of people who can't afford who could never afford home ownership and were in the rental market because it once was more an affordable option. So it's becoming more of a challenge now to provide that affordable housing. So the financialization, we talk about the financialization of purpose-built rentals. Why are they doing it? They're doing it because they can. They can turn these units around and charge $2,400 for a 1 plus den.
For 650 square feet. That's amazing. Do you want to pick up on that? Or what do you see as the implications of all of this?
Well, sure. If you're building new rental supply and it's going to cost $2,400, that's not addressing the affordable housing crisis that we have. And it won't, because the investors that are doing this purpose-built rental are doing it because they want to charge those top of market prices. So I think it's disingenuous to argue we need more supply if there's not going to be any controls on those prices. I'll also say that a lot of the rental housing that we're looking at here in the GTA and across the country isn't new purpose-built, it's the old stuff that was built in the 60s and the 70s. And that is being financialized too, which gets covered in the film. She talks about companies like Blackstone, private equity firm. But we have lots and lots of financial vehicles in Canada that are acquiring and in fact consolidating ownership of existing multifamily rental stock. And the strategy that these owners are using in order to drive profits for their investors, I should say, really rely on driving up rents for people. and ultimately rely on pushing people out of their homes. The biggest way that these companies make money for their investors is what they call unit turns. Taking a unit where somebody lives, getting it vacant, and then driving that rent up.
Because in Ontario, you can raise the rent pretty much as you like if you can get the old tenant out and the new tenant in.
Yes, it's called vacancy decontrol, something that was brought in by the Harris government in 1997. That created this tremendous incentive for these types of firms, real estate investment trusts, private equity, other types of financial vehicles to acquire and consolidate ownership of multifamily housing. They did it specifically to take advantage of vacancy decontrol, seeing it coming down the pipeline, and we've been seeing rents going up ever since then. And we've been seeing the transformation of neighborhoods. I mean, we just saw a clip from Parkdale. That's a place where lots and lots of buildings are being acquired. People in those buildings, working people who lived in that community forever, have a connection to those places, are finding that their landlords are pushing them out, raising rents. And then the next person that comes in, the gentrifier, they're also being gouged. And so those, I think, are the natural allies of the tenants that are being displaced.
But let's understand, Benjamin, a bit of how we got here. What role did low interest rates, historically low interest rates for the last many years, play in where we're at today?
It was basically the main reason why we are seeing what we are seeing, because we know that for the past 20 years, interest rates have been going down and down and down for many, many reasons. Demographics, people are getting older. We look at Japan, interest rates are negative there. Europe, interest rates are negative, and we are very low. So clearly the demographic story, people getting older, is a main factor. Inflation expectations went down. Therefore, interest rates going down. So that will remain the case. That's not something that will change tomorrow. And therefore, we have to get used to this kind of situation. Now, when interest rates are very low and all those big financial players are looking for return, and the GIC will not do, so what do? You look for alternative investment, which is real estate. So real estate has been king over the past 20 years, and it will remain a very attractive investment given low interest rates. So that's how we got there. The demographic story and low interest rates is the main factor. Demand for real estate is rising and rising and rising, and especially in Canada, where immigration is so significant in terms of playing a role in the demand equation. So all those forces are here to stay. Going back to the issue of rent, we have to distinguish between affordable housing and housing affordability. Affordable housing is clearly a market failure. People need a place to live, and the government needs to provide this kind of assistance. But I'm talking about the other part of the equation, namely young families trying to buy a house in Toronto. They simply cannot afford it. And that's why I believe, and we can discuss it maybe, that the next wave of real estate in Toronto, to an extent in Canada, is actually renting as opposed to owning. I think that at 70%, we have reached the peak of home ownership in Canada, and I think that you will see more and more people renting, and we will start changing the way we view renting. Namely, you are 35 years old, you are married, you have 2 kids, and you are renting, nothing is wrong with you.
That's an okay scenario.
That
Martine,
will
what's
be
your
the
view
case.
on that?
Yeah, I think lots of people are renting. I don't have any problem. I know that we have a homeownership ideology in North America that sometimes stigmatizes renters as not quite there yet in their housing career. I disagree with that. I think renting is fine. However, we just see the prices going up and up and up. That $2,400 figure is so high, people can't afford that. And so what we need, I mean, I agree with Benjamin, we need more government investment in housing. We need rent controls. We need to make it so that people can afford to stay, live in the city where they work, raise their families in places that they love.
Having said that, Shaun, tell me what it is about whatever makes Toronto magic at the moment, that it is such a supremely wonderful place, apparently, to invest in real estate.
Well, if you look at housing prices, historically in Toronto, they've only declined 1 year in the past 22 years. So basically, you've seen almost uninterrupted growth in housing prices for almost a full generation. And now we have basically a generation of home buyers that have only seen the value of real estate rise, and they've seen only record low interest rates. So it factors into their psyche that investing in real estate is a very wise decision. Now it's the fact that 70% of all household assets are actually in real estate. We also have seen immigration levels rise above 100,000 a year in the GTA. We have one of the, or if not the fastest growing economy in the country. So job creation has been exceptionally strong. We see immigration coming in and boosting housing demand to the point that we're seeing demand for rental housing at 25,000 units a year. we're building maybe on a good year between the condo rental stock and the purpose-built rental stock, maybe 10 to 15,000 units a year. So there's 10,000 units a year that we're not getting. So the rental development industry is starting to recognize this, and we're starting to see some progress made on supply. We have about 14 to 15,000 units under construction, which may sound like a lot, but there's 75,000 condos under construction. So it's still a very, very tiny portion of overall housing development. But one of the things that we noticed happen after the provincial government removed rent control for anything newly built going forward is that we saw a 40% spike in proposals coming in for new purpose-built rental developments. So now we have close to 60,000 units in the pipeline. I can tell you from the work that we do on doing market feasibility studies for rental developers, there's probably another 50, 60,000 that's planned ahead of that. So we're going to get there eventually. The problem is that a lot of these units are located downtown. The rents are relatively high. But one of the magical things that you see happen when more supply comes into the market is that rents begin to stabilize. And we're starting to see that right now. This year in Toronto, we'll see the highest level of apartment completions that we've seen probably on record. And because most of those condos were bought by investors, they'll go directly into the rental pool. Some of the stats that I'm seeing over the last 6 months suggest that rents are actually flattening out. And as that happens, you begin to see a filtering effect down to the rest of the marketplace. We're also starting to see more development applications coming into the suburbs where the rents don't need to be $2,400 a month.
Well, let me pick up on that with Diana. There is a tendency when you live in Toronto to think that this is the center of the universe and whatever's happening here is happening maybe everywhere. I want to know in the province of Ontario, is it basically a Toronto phenomenon, but everywhere else it's normal?
Well, I think that's the interesting part about Ontario is that prices are rising just as quickly outside of the city, and the gap between rents within the city and the rest of the Greater Toronto area, if you include Hamilton, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, don't vary by that much. Like, you're not going to be spending less by moving to, say, the York region, and then now you have to add the commute in because all the jobs are in the city of Toronto, which is why I think you saw a lot of the demand. What is interesting now, though, is we take it for granted that everybody does want to be in the city of Toronto, and we are starting to see millennials, first-time home buyers, and other generations, other age groups also leaving the city of Toronto. We have intra-provincial migration, which is people moving within the province. Shows that people are actually leaving the city of Toronto and the Toronto CMA for other areas in Ontario. Like, they're not even staying within sort of that general commute area. They're going beyond what we call the Greater Golden Horseshoe.
And those decisions are made overwhelmingly because of housing reasons.
Yeah, you can chart migration flows with housing affordability, and as home ownership has been going up, you've seen the opposite trend, people leaving the region.
How are they doing that? Because presumably if they needed to be here, it was because there was a job here that required them to be here. If you're moving 2-3 hours away, you can't take the job with you in many cases, so how's that working?
Well, actually, the most interesting is that Ottawa seems to be benefiting from inflows, and Ottawa has the lowest, is the region with the lowest unemployment rate across the country. So they're moving for affordable housing, but I think they're also moving for job prospects elsewhere now.
Is this happening in Ottawa as well?
Or the financialization of rental housing?
Yeah, this whole
Absolutely,
story.
yeah, it's happening all across the country. You can see this in the major markets in the GTA, Toronto, Vancouver. You can also see it filtering down to secondary, tertiary markets, mobile home parks, the far north, resource communities. These types of financial vehicles are rapidly acquiring multifamily housing, rental housing across the country, and applying a series of aggressive property management strategies to drive greater returns to their investors. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a strategy that really gets those profits don't come as if from magic. They really come from the pockets of the tenants living in those buildings. There's really only so many ways that you can raise value for your investors. And the value that's being raised is for the investors, and it's coming from the tenants. So what we're seeing here is this sort of wealth transfer. It is almost mirroring the broader transformation of wealth that's been happening with financialization over the last couple decades. This is the type of thing that Thomas Piketty talks about in his book Capital. This is the type of thing that the Occupy Wall Street were talking about, this shift in which you have the 1% increasingly growing wealthier while you see working people's wages stagnating. And so we see that happening now, where people who are living in apartment buildings are seeing a greater portion of their income go towards investors who are pooling their capital and buying these properties.
If you would like to see us transform into a society where you can be in your mid-30s, have a family, and live in rental accommodation, and that's just fine, then presumably we want to start introducing policies to ensure that there's going to be a lot more rental stock out there. What have you got in mind?
Absolutely, and I think that purpose-built is a solution. I totally agree that the condo market cannot be the rental market, and the rental market cannot be the condo market, because the new wave of renters, and that's the reality, are going to be families with kids or baby boomers that will be downsizing. Both of them don't want to deal with a landlord. They want to deal with a company, stable, and they need this kind of arrangement. Therefore, increased supply of purpose-built apartment buildings is crucial for the solution to the real estate crisis we are facing. And therefore, we need to make sure that people are getting used to the idea. So we have to change expectations when it comes to housing. It's not just you graduate, you get from university or not, you get married, you have 2 kids, and then you buy a house. Now maybe you'll be renting, but we need to make sure that the supply is there. The unit size must be relevant to families. So we have to rethink the way we supply, and governments can play a role here by, let's say, allowing those builders to actually make money out of this development.
So what policies do we need to make sure that happens?
For example, you can reduce development charges. You can actually give them a break on HST. There are many, many factors or tricks that you can come up with just to increase supply. Shaun was talking about some increase that is happening. I say that's not enough. We need much more than that. That's a solution to our crisis.
Reducing development charges, does that not mean you're going to have fewer parks, fewer daycare spaces in the neighborhood, fewer amenities in the neighborhood?
Well, that's the trick. We have to find a real practical solution to the issue. We need more supply and then try to come up with a way to live smarter. And we can do it with technology. So I think that that's the direction. We need more supply. The issue is not demand. I'll tell you one thing. I was in Ottawa the other day, and some people are starting to talk about reducing immigration as a solution. We are an aging society. We need new immigrants. We'll need them more than ever in the future.
So you don't like that idea?
So I don't think it's a good idea, but it's basically a sign of desperation. And one more point about that. If we don't fix this housing issue, we will not get those 100,000 coming to Toronto, because they will go somewhere else. Because at one point, they will say Toronto is not a city we can live in because, you know, the infrastructure is not there, housing is not there. That's not good enough. So we need to attract them, not to reduce the number. And the only way to do it is to make sure that housing is affordable, and rental is the solution.
In which case, Martine, ideas, ideas, ideas. How are we going to put the policies in place that will encourage more purpose-built rental?
Yeah, I think the financial investment by these types of firms into purpose-built rental and into acquiring existing rental isn't really solving the problem. So what we've seen happen over the decades is more and more investment in luxury housing that's where people pay expensive rents. We haven't seen prices falling. In fact, it's been the opposite. So I think there's an argument out here about how we need more and more supply. It's an argument that's really favored by developers. And we don't see that magical, we don't see it filtering down, you know? And I think the idea of filter down economics was debunked years ago.
Okay, in which case, what have you got on offer?
I'm saying that that the government actually shouldn't be subsidizing real estate investment trusts and private equity funds with government-backed lending, providing them with those low rates, and then allowing them to drive this affordability crisis, pushing people out of their homes and raising rents in an affordability crisis. So I don't think that CMHC, for example, our federal housing agency, should be giving these people the access to the cheap financing so that they can keep worsening the problem.
Okay, you've told me twice now what they shouldn't do. What should they do?
I think that they should build, social housing. This is what Benjamin is saying. We don't need to have this middleman that's making the profit with.
I don't think he was saying that. I didn't hear him say that.
Okay, let me. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but what I should say is that we haven't tried this in a while. We've had decades and decades in which we've had the federal government step away from providing social housing. The private sector has not swept in and provided us with affordable housing. In fact, we've just seen prices get worse and worse and worse, and people are getting squeezed. So what we need to do is have the government, which has lots of money, invest in social housing. I'm not talking about low-quality social housing. I'm talking about wonderful, net zero emissions, social housing that's destigmatized. That would be an interesting and innovative solution that we could try. And we haven't tried it in decades, and we haven't seen the private sector come in and provide a better solution.
You don't look all that excited.
No, I think that social housing is definitely the right thing to do, but social housing will not solve the problem, because social housing is dealing with the margin of society that are struggling, and we need to help them as a society. So I totally with you on this one. But social housing is not the main issue. The main issue is middle-income families with 2 kids that cannot afford housing in Toronto. That's not social housing. We need to help them as well, and that's where you need the supply. So we have to distinguish between those 2 forces.
Martine?
I would just say on the supply thing too, the other thing we need to do is stop the rents from going up. If we're so worried about affordability, don't allow companies to gouge families anymore. Implement actual rent controls. I think what we need to do is also prevent there from being loopholes that allow landlords to raise rents through above guideline increases in which you can charge back the cost for major capital repairs onto tenants. Really cut that off so that rents will stay low, so that people will have security of tenure, so that they can stay in their communities. And I will just say, because I can anticipate the response that I'm going to get from economists on this, which is that, in 1991, we had this rent control was removed on anything built after 1991. Let's go back and look at how much got built. It only started very, very recently that we started to see, there was decades and decades and decades in which the private sector could have capitalized on the magical incentive that was going to be provided by removing rent control. Didn't happen.
Well, they weren't in 1991 because it was the worst recession since the Great Depression.
It's been a while, and we've just seen the start of the investment. And guess what else? We're seeing, federal government investing in private multifamily rental construction right now, and we're starting to see a little bit more public incentive for that. I think if the federal government has money to put in building purpose-built rental, it should be built for social purpose. I believe that we talked earlier about whether housing is a social good. I think it should be. I believe people are coming around to that way of thinking.
Let's get some wisdom from this side of the table. Okay, Shaun, some ideas from you.
So first, I think, just kind of going back to that 1991 exemption. So one of the big reasons why developers didn't start building rental back then, when rent control was removed, was because there wasn't really much rental demand growth. Actually, on a net basis, we were losing renters for a good couple of decades. And the reason behind that was that there was a big push to put renters into the home ownership market, right? We saw CMHC introduce things like 40-year amortization, 0% down programs, and we saw this massive run-up in home ownership during this period of time. However, 15 years later, we're at this point where housing prices in the GTA are 107% higher than they were 10 years ago, and now we're starting to shut out a lot of renter households into the home ownership market. So I think some of the things that we're starting to see happen, like public-private partnerships that are seeing, the City of Toronto release 11 transit-oriented sites that are, mandating to include 50% of the units as affordable housing. The other 50% being market rate is helping to sort of bring in more affordable
social housing. That's housing with a public-spirited mission, right?
Yeah. So the rents are about 80% of the average tenanted rent, according to the CMHC average. So they're probably 30-40% below actual market values.
So that will go some way to dealing with some of these issues?
Yeah, I think a little bit. If we see more and more of that happen, on the provincial side, we're seeing provincial lands being opened up to developers, and then there's a bit of a rebate or market rebate on the land because there's also affordable housing component, 30% of the units being affordable housing. So these initiatives, I think, are starting to help on the margins. But really, I think going back to what Benjamin said, we just need more market rate purpose-built rental supply. And I do think that there's an argument that even if that market rate supply comes in at $2,300 or $2,400 a month, there's been a lot of empirical research that has shown that it does help calm rent growth for the rest of the marketplace, right? Real estate is priced on a relative basis. It's very simple. So when the top end of the market begins to slow down, you start to see that happen across the rest of the market. One of the issues is that with rent control, people don't move. People don't move as often. In Toronto, we have the lowest level of rental turnover in the country. 9% of people are moving on an annual basis.
And why is that?
Because they're locked in at their rents that are only growing by 1% a year. So I think there's an argument that can be made that, yes, rental control plays a role in a market that's become relatively unaffordable like Toronto, but there's also an argument for maybe it being a little bit more dynamic and allowing rents to grow by a more reasonable rate so you don't get into situations where the landlord is not doing repairs on the units because they can't make economic sense of doing so in some cases, and the rents are allowed to grow in line with their costs, which could be, inflation plus 1% or 2% or something like that.
Diana, a couple of minutes to go here. You got some ideas you want to share?
Well, yeah, first I just want to point out, yes, the region is building a lot, but I think we're underestimating the demographic impact of aging of millennials, and they are wealthier. and moving into like their high income earning years. So there's a lot being built, but we still can't accommodate for that demographic shift. So, and if you look at a chart of rent growth versus vacancy rates, so vacancy rates are how many units are sitting empty, there is a direct correlation. So I do think that supply is part of the answer. So yes, we're building a lot, but we're still not meeting demand. In terms of social housing, it's a great goal, but it's also quite expensive. So we look at a place like Vienna where they make sure that everybody has an affordable place to live. 60% of the population live in in housing that has been supported by the government. But the country itself devotes 3% of GDP to housing expenditures. And I'm not sure, like the federal government here, if that's a realistic outcome for the government here in Canada. So in the meantime, if we can't get that, we do need more supply. And I think, regulation, not all regulation is good. We need to start looking at what is productive and what is unproductive. So if we think about these areas that are gentrifying, particularly, let's say, the city of Toronto, why then is the municipality or supporting or allowing gentrification of poor neighborhoods, but then protecting wealthier neighborhoods with zoning rules and keeping development out of those areas?
We got a lot to chew on here today.
Yeah.
I want to thank all four of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. Diana Petramala from Ryerson University Center for Urban Research, Shaun Hildebrand from Urban Nation, and on the other side of the table, Martine August, the professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo, and Benjamin Tal, Deputy Chief Economist, CIBC Capital Markets. And of course, we urge everybody to stick around and watch Push, the documentary that that kickstarted our conversation here, in which the four of you all gave 2 thumbs, or I guess 8 thumbs up if we add them all up together. 8 thumbs up to. Thanks, everybody. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.